under the Convention for Biological Diversity, we're supposed to have 30 by 30% of the oceans protected. So we've reached the number, but we haven't stopped the damaging activities.
When we design things, we don't think about that, what we do after with it. How do we get rid of that? What happens to it?
Welcome to the Society for the Environment EnvCast, where we feature special guests highlighting an environment top 5 each month. Each month, we welcome 2 environmental professionals to explore what they believe to be the top 5 things to consider within a particular topic. Topics range from climate to leadership, agriculture to AI, and everything in between. Look out for some curveballs in the top 5 each month, and remember, we can't cover every important thing within a topic. Our aim is to uncover how you can be part of the solution, to learn from the experts, and to sometimes think outside of the box as we strive for a sustainable future. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to EnvCast for another Environment Top 5, this time focusing on protecting the marine environment. I'm Phil from Society for the Environment and your podcast host for today. As always, we'll be having a good chat with our 2 registered environmental professionals and exploring key topics from different perspectives to expand our collective knowledge and hopefully make more impact. To look into the top 5 things for professionals across different sectors to consider in and around the topic of protecting the marine environment, we're joined by 2 Chartered Environmentalists. Their biographies are in the podcast description, but as extremely short introductions, I'm very pleased to be joined by Katie Reeves, who is a marine environmental consultant and director of SOME Consultancy, SOME Consultancy. Katie is a Chartered Environmentalist via membership of the Institute of Sustainability and Environmental Professionals, or ISEP for short, formerly IEMA, and Tanya Ferry, who is Managing Director of PAMFALASA and a Chartered Environmentalist via membership of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, or CEnv for short. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you very much for joining us today. So let's go straight into the top 5. We're going to alternate between Katie and Tanya for the first 4, and then the final item is for them to agree upon as a top thing to consider for marine life or protecting marine life. The key takeaways for our listeners. So, number 1, I'm handing straight over to Katie to talk about protected marine areas. But first, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Just a bit of context.
My name's Katie Reeves. I've been working in and around marine science for about coming up to 30 years. And I started off working in the port industry, and then I went into environmental NGOs in the UK, working from the Marine Conservation Society. I've worked as a statutory nature conservation agency person in Natural England on the coastal area up in the northwest. And then I have also worked for WWF and the Wildlife Trusts. And then I moved abroad to the Middle East and worked largely for big energy companies or consultancies on biodiversity projects out there, but also environmental consenting. I was lucky enough, when we talk about marine protected areas, to be in one of the first highly protected marine area workshops in the UK that was pulled together by the IUCN and Natural England at the time. And that's when some of the first highly protected marine areas came into the UK. So there was one on the Lamlash Bay off the Isle of Arran, which is amazing. And I got to meet some of those people. And at the same time, there was the campaign for the Marine Act, which I was part of, and that was to introduce a mechanism to have highly protected marine reserves. So we actually have in the UK about 38% parks, marine protected areas through various mechanisms. First of all, the Habitats Directive, and then we moved across to the Marine Act to have marine conservation zones. But of that 38%, they're still in not good ecological status. Some are in unfavourable status. And so both the UK, the different governments, the different devolved agencies as well have been told off recently. The Scots have recently had the Environmental Standards Scotland just came out and said that there wasn't enough being done to protect the seabeds around Scotland. And then last year, the Office for Environmental Protection said again that the marine that a number of different areas of marine protected areas were not in good ecological status either. So that's some of the parts of that I've worked on. But now moving into energy, the energy sector in the UK, I'm doing a project that's in a marine protected area. I can't say too much because I'm under an NDA, but it's interesting. It's in unfavourable conservation status, and people are still trying to put in infrastructure or decommissioning, and there still isn't enough data out there on that marine protected area that we're working on. And I was quite surprised coming back from the Middle East on that we don't understand where certain features are or what the monitoring is. So yeah, it's not surprising that maybe they don't have a handle on what the status is, but there isn't systematic monitoring of some of those offshore marine protected areas as well.
Interesting. So we haven't got everything right yet for the marine protected areas or for the rest of the marine world. I've learned things already. I didn't realise that there were protected marine areas or protected marine environments, and highly protected marine environments. I'm intrigued by the difference between something that's protected and something that's highly protected. The ratings must be interesting.
So when we talk about anything that's protected, can be a line on the sea. And sometimes we talk about paper parks. So they've been protected under legislation, and we've drawn a line. And it's very, very similar to the national park. So I live close to the two in Yorkshire, and you could just put a line and you've driven across it, and it's the same in the sea. You've sailed across what is a protected area, but they could still be dredging in that park. They could still be fishing. They could still be undertaking what are damaging activities within that protected area. So even though we have 38% of the seabed protected or as marine protected areas, and there's a global, under the Convention for Biological Diversity, we're supposed to have 30% of the oceans protected. And so we've reached the number, but we haven't stopped the damaging activities. And I think there's confusion. I heard a very, very good article by a lawyer that deals with a lot of compensation of big energy things. And she just said it's very confusing as to what the priority is for the oceans. And so they can be it for offshore wind farms for energy. It could be for fisheries to produce the protein for the coastal for not just the coastal population, but the whole of the UK. You could almost say is coastal. We're never more than 70 miles from the sea in the UK. So it's what their priority is, and they've got commitments to have marine protected areas, but also to have them in this good status. And so they're still failing at doing that, and they just need to prioritise, do they want to do this? And I think there's a mandate from the UK population that they do want to protect it, and they do want these. So and I think that's been proven by NGOs in numerous different campaigns. And if you ask people, they do care about it. You look at the way that sewage pollution is going, and they clearly do want to have nice biodiversity, but we're very biodiverse poor. So I think there's confusion as to what the policy aims are. And so you do have those 38% protected, and now it's to take away those damaging activities, such as trawling on the seabed, but dredging. Lots and lots of wind farms are going in because of the argument for climate change, but also energy security, and they're ramping them up. But it's what exactly is your priority, and if you're going to have these marine protected areas, they do need to have damaging activities looked at.
Interesting. And there are different ways of protecting marine environments, right? So we're going to be talking about plastics at some point. There's obviously the marine life and biodiversity and so on. And I guess different parts of the world will have different priorities in that sense. Is there or should there be? Is it regional in terms of the priorities that are put on marine protection? Or is it a globally known structure that allows people to prioritize what they're doing to protect?
It's a globally known structure. So having worked in the Middle East, and recently I'm working on a governance project, and they want to have marine protected areas, and they do have some. there's a big whale shark area right in the middle of, very, very topical, the Arabian Gulf. So you don't come far into the Straits of Hormuz, and then there's massive aggregation. The second biggest aggregation of whale sharks is there. And it's a very dynamic system because of the way that the water currents come along the Iranian coast and then round through the Gulf. So it creates like these eddies. And so you have this amazing absolutely amazing phenomenon every summer where it upwells, and then you have this really high productivity and loads of fish eggs, and that's why the whale sharks and lots of other species actually come. So we've done monitoring on the whale sharks, but there's also additional species of marine mammals and cetaceans that come. And there's actually more recently they found more turtles are coming as well as specific species, the loggerhead, which hasn't been seen in the Gulf as well. They nest on further out in the Arabian Sea, but they don't. So there's these natural phenomena, and I think they want to protect it, but it's just how they do that. And so they are further behind in their thinking, but and so marine protected areas are well known, but it's very, very hard. It's easy to put, again, the same as anything. It's very easy to draw on the map and designate it. It's just extremely hard to then get the management and the enforcement. Well, not the enforcement. It's better to bring the community along with you when you set it up, and to have management practices and say we're going to do this, and to go out to consultation and to ensure that the community that's around those areas are going to come along with you. I mean, this area I talked about actually is in a lot of energy concessions are around it, so there's actually less disturbance. There's not as much fisheries. It's almost like pseudo, but obviously there are not as many. There's WWF out there. There are not as many NGOs as well, but they'd like to see the whole area protected, but also have the energy removed, which won't happen in the immediate future, but different ways will happen out there compared to how we do it in the UK. So it's different. It's done much more by a community-based approach that's much more softly because the culture's different. So there are definitely different approaches across the world to it. But the concept that you protect something, you take away all damaging activities, nature will recover in different ways. And so that has happened globally all over, from our cold water corals to the tropical corals to anywhere. Yeah. It does have an impact, and it does enable nature to recover and have spillover effects into fisheries that are around it. Did that answer the question?
I think it probably did. I'm going to listen back for the detail. But moving beyond the marine protected areas, and I'm going to ask one more question on this before we move on to topic number 2. I guess outside of those areas, there's still obviously protection to be done. We still need to look after our marine environments, whether they're designated protected areas or not. And I'm intrigued about the other mechanism for doing that, because I guess, like in farming, do the requirements and asks of the buyers, so when it comes to fishing and so on, like supermarkets, can they make a difference in terms of what they're asking for from the suppliers? And does that have any impact on marine environments and how they fish and things like that? Which I guess some of that will happen outside of marine protected environments, right?
Yes. So fisheries, I think people know about the MSC, the Marine, what's it called?
Stewardship
Council. Yes, the you can get a blue tick on your fish and aquaculture. So there's also an aquaculture one as well. And if you see the blue tick, I am not as good on fisheries and fisheries management, but know that would be something to look for, that fisheries do. And the Marine Conservation Society has something called the Good Fish Guide. So you can choose the most sustainable fish as a consumer. You can do that and you can choose it. And a lot of inshore, coastal, smaller fleets are more sustainable anyway. It's the much larger offshore fleets that are the ones that are doing the bigger damage, and the ones that are obviously hoovering everything up just because they are on an industrial fishery scale. So you can definitely look for that tick, but you can also look for the Good Fish Guide from the Marine Conservation Society and choose what fish you like, both as a consumer, but the inshore fishermen also do have a lot of case too. And I've been in lots of different fisheries organisations and discussions with people to say, would you want to have a marine protected area here? When I was working in Northern Ireland, I asked them, the potting fishermen, because there's a lot of potting that happens there, that can we, around an area called the Maidens, it's a beautiful rock with high tidal race around it, and saying, can we introduce like a highly protected marine reserve here, just like that in Lamlash Bay, or at that point they set one up in Lundy Island, and so I had that discussion with them, and they're like, no, because this bit is mine, that bit's his, that bit's, and if you push us out, this means that I don't get my bit. And so it was really, really difficult to try and again draw a line on a map, but to try and get them to agree to that. So I've had discussions with fishermen, and they do seem quite reticent to do it in certain areas. But it's all about having those discussions with them and trying to bring them on board. It's not easy though. It's not.
Could I add some other examples, because Katie's
Absolutely.
just touched on Lundy, and that was with the fishermen. So the protected area was with the fishermen, and they saw the benefit of doing that protection and drawing those lines. And there's another couple that have come out on the south coast as well as a result of liaising with the fishermen. But the Stewardship Council, that process that's very much engaged in the fish supply, and it has obviously everything when it comes to an audit, there are gaps in what they can see and what they can't see, but they do interact directly with the fishing fleet, so there potentially is much more in depth on site benefit for some of the species. Local to me in the Thames, we have the cockle fishery, and that is in a protected area already, but it in itself operates at a large scale sustainably within that protected area. So it's also layering it up. There's also sort of voluntary examples again in the Thames and the Medway, where the fishing organisations have actually closed areas themselves, so not to take from that area in order to provide recruitment. I was going to touch on that in terms of data later, but there are examples where fishermen have identified that there is going to be an issue for future population growth, and they want to do something positive, and they've been supported by the UK regulatory system in order to do that protection, where there may be a private fishery initially, but they've been supported elsewhere in terms of the statutory requirements as well. So there are ways of working on the grassroots side of things and really making a difference to areas that might be already protected, but potentially not for that particular species, and adding benefit to the wider protected areas and habitats.
Okay, on topic one, so much covered already. This is going to be good. I like it. So we'll move on to topic number two. So we're going to be covering the topic of, and Tanya's just mentioned there, really, data collection and monitoring in the sector. But as I hand over, could you provide a little bit of context about what you do?
Yes, so I am an aquatic ecologist by training. In my consultancy, we do source to sea, so we work in freshwater right down to the coast. Like Katie, I did do some work in ports, and so I've worked in maritime, but also in estuaries, and I've worked for the fisheries teams in the Environment Agency as well, so very fish focused. But I also sit on a marine focused funding charity, Sea Changers, and we do quite a lot of work to support grassroots operations and organisations. But I also run my own grassroots organisation in the local area as well, trying to engage people with estuaries, because people see it particularly in the southeast, as dirty and unpleasant and muddy, and so we put people in wellies and show them how muddy it is. So yes, that's me. In terms of data, I don't know where, Phil, you want me to head to? Start with the...
Yeah. Where do you want to start?
Well, so Katie actually mentioned it earlier. There's a lot of work around setting up a lot of these protected areas, sometimes with data, sometimes without. But often the ongoing work afterwards to maintain that protection and make sure the features are benefiting from the protection, or even that the status is being maintained, is something that seems to slip off the balance sheet in terms of funding, and it becomes quite challenging to deal with the consenting process. Developers trying to find out exactly what their impacts are. There's no data. The last time it was when it was protected is perhaps the last time there was a condition assessment. And there's been some work to improve that through the Marine Nature Capital Environmental Assessment work, but that is, generally speaking, either the developer has to go and collect the data itself to understand what's going on at the time in relation to its own construction and development, or it's unfortunately grassroots organisations that end up doing a lot of that data collection. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all, and we do a lot of work around, even in Pampalasa, supporting citizen scientists to do good data collection and protect and getting out there to provide a data set that is perhaps something that is longer term, is potentially more low cost than the regulators might be able to fund. But it is something, and I think Katie mentioned communities earlier. If it is a really positive way to engage a local community with the environment that they're potentially protecting or is being protected adjacent to them and maybe affecting some of their economics. But it is something that I think if we continue this way, there is a question about how and who is responsible for data collection and monitoring of these protected areas that the government and respective governments have put in place, because you find that if it is done, potentially it's the webs counts for birds. Sometimes there are ornithological surveys on a regular basis for development. But then there's the poorer groups like marine mammals. That's done ad hoc, potentially by sightings and data that has been sent to biological record centres, and then fish, where I would be getting out and trying to monitor, is often split between 3 or 4 different agencies, particularly in England. In estuaries and on the coast, you end up with the Environment Agency having some part of the fish population, particularly the migratory fish. Then you have the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authorities, the IFCAs, doing monitoring potentially on the sea fish, and then you potentially have CFAS potentially crossing over those two as well. So you've got different people doing different data, and all struggling with the funding in terms of streams. And of course, when I talk about fish and marine mammals, they're not, while there are lines in the charts, as Katie talked about, that may be data from that area, but actually the adjacent, the fish or the porpoise does not know that they're on one side or other of a line. They'll use the habitat and the features that they see as beneficial for them. And so the data monitoring needs to be responding to that and not just focusing within that box. I've surveyed in that box. I've done the benthic surveys in that area. And that's not the developer's role when they come to do any assessments. That the lack of baseline is quite a challenge for a lot of developers. And presumably on the other side for the regulators to complete an appropriate assessment, and it does force potentially some precautionary approach, which makes it quite difficult to manage. So there is a great opportunity to engage local people to do this, but they can't get out 12 miles offshore. So there's also a bit of a data gap in terms of frequency. Vessels are expensive. Our coastline is not the friendliest place at times to be out, so you can only do it in the summer. So then everybody's out monitoring at the same time of year.
Yeah.
So then you get into what we're going to cover later in terms of volume and number of people and skills to do it.
What a challenge to present that is. Crikey. For a start, marine animals and so on, not staying in the same place all the time, that's got to be slightly frustrating because when you're collecting data on those. And I guess the more, linking the two topics together so far, the more we protect areas, am I right in saying the more data we need to collect to ensure that they're being protected properly? Absolutely. So then becomes an ongoing skills challenge. which will be an interesting one to try to address. But I guess something else that came to mind whilst thinking about those skills, it sounds like quite an exciting thing to be doing when you're going out and monitoring and collecting data in the marine environment. I assume you're going out on boats and that kind of thing. There's diving involved on occasions, that kind of thing. And if it's in good news, if it's an exciting job, it might encourage some people to do it. And whilst also doing some quite serious work in the process. Can it be seen in that way? Is that a good way of promoting it to people?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, there are the glamorous bits of being on a boat,
Yes.
and the unglamorous bits of being on a boat. I spend quite a lot of time in salt marshes, and they tend to be a lot muddier and messier. But there's still a glamorous aspect, and we do actually do salt marsh surveys with volunteers as in my not-for-profit, and a lot of them and the volunteers actually find it's really amazing well-being because they're waiting for the tide. They're being forced to stop. They don't have their laptops, their phones in front of them because they're drop them in the mud or the salt marsh. They tend to leave them behind. So the sort of unintentional stop to watch the tide come in and watch the tide go back out to catch the fish is an amazing experience for them. Some of them have gone as far as buying their own chest waders because they've enjoyed it so much. So there is their well-being, but you're right, the career aspect of it, it is a tantalizingly exciting aspect of a marine ecologist's role. Once you collect data, there's the other perhaps less exciting aspect of data analytics, which a lot of people aren't very keen on, and the report writing that goes with it. So you end up seeing sort of a seasonal shift in work throughout the time, unless you can work across the globe and you sort of travel around. But then again, you need to know your ecology, to know of the environment. We talked about temperate and warm water corals. They're very different ecosystems. There's a lot of ID that needs to be going with that. So there is it is the UK going to count turtle eggs comparison, I suppose, in terms of marine ecology, glittering, exciting career. But it is sometimes wet, horrible, rainy, stormy, and we're in the UK, let's face it. And you might end up weeks in a town that you don't know, waiting for the window to go out. So there are sort of the other aspects of that. But to your point around protected areas and needing more of them, the mobile species, having a network of the right types of habitats for each of their life cycle stages is really important, and that is very much a international challenge rather than just a UK challenge. We need to be working with other governments in other locations to make sure the species that are travelling from north to south, east to west are protected at their other locations. Otherwise, we're going to see impacts that we can't control on the populations in the local areas.
So I guess that makes a lot of sense. The fact that you have breeding areas and you have feeding areas as well, and so on, for marine animals, and it's fair to say that some of them don't just go from a small area to another small area. We're talking about global travel here, aren't we? And the need you mentioned there to talk to different areas, to governments in the different areas of the world and so on. That must be a challenge in terms of data, is sharing that data. Is that a challenge? Is that happening freely? Are there different methods of collecting data and then interpreting that is just a nightmare? You're both nodding quite a lot here, I guess. So it sounds like a challenge, and we have people hopefully listening from around the world. And I know we have chartered environmentalists, for example, in Mauritius, who looks after marine conservation and so on. So that might be slightly more glamorous maybe than wading in the Thames. But
yes,
that data collection and sharing element sounds like a challenge, judging by the nodding.
Absolutely. I think, there is an intention across the globe. I think, Katie, you'd agree that everybody wants to make sure that data is available and viable, and is collected in a as best as possible standard way. There are standard approaches in the UK for JNCC do a lot of guidance for things, and the Institute of Fisheries Management do for fish as well. So there's other, and as ISEP, of course, for how that's collected and what the standards and practices are, and those are built from global experience and knowledge as well as the local environment we find ourselves in. But it is even a challenge in the UK to find data. So there's standard data sets that regulatory bodies publish for meeting directives. I won't go into the specifics, but doing a piece of work for a client, I was looking for data that was in theory in the public domain. It should have been on every patch that I looked at, but for some reason theirs wasn't published. No idea why. And so they have a data gap, and in order to request that data, it's a process, and you have to wait for that time to pass for that information to then be collected. It may have been not published because it wasn't in a coherent manner, and they've never got round to making that possible. So sometimes there is those gaps, but as both of us have said, there's also gaps full stop, because it's not being collected in the first place. So when you share it, often you won't find that comparable in a different area or a different place. And then of course for the developers, where arguably a lot more of the data is collected and held, they're not required to publish it, and may not want to, for very good reason, until very long after their development has been gone. So that data sort of is lost in the process for the time being, which is understandable. It's just a fact of doing your development and getting your consenting, but it does become a challenge.
Right. So yes, challenges to try and address and work around sometimes, I guess, to try and move forward positively with the different projects that professionals are working on. Speaking of challenges, we're going to go to another challenge, which is hit the news over recent years. It's fair to say. We're going back to Katie for the number 3, the huge topic of plastic pollution, but more specifically, microplastics, the huge topic of microplastics. Katie, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, in my lifetime, but in my kids' lifetime as well, they were born 17, 14 years ago. And it's been really interesting to watch the scale of microplastics come onto beaches. And you can see it. It's not, you can see the nurdles, you can see the microfibers sometimes. And then also, obviously, the plastics that have broken up in the marine environment, which shatter, so larger pieces, which are then broken up, and then they float on the surface or get attached to other. They can clump together either through pollution or in eddies and areas that people all know about, like the great big garbage patch in the Pacific. Myself, when I've unfortunately been in eddy areas, so say like in the middle of bobbing around in the middle of the Arabian Gulf, lucky enough to be doing monitoring on whale sharks and things like that, and then just putting my hand through the water and being able to feel like several different bits of microfibers of nurdles and things, and being able to just collect them and tuck them down into my it's not a wetsuit out there, but it's a full skin because of sun protection. But yeah, so tucking away and trying to collect whatever I can, but it's there, it's very, very prevalent. They're only just starting there to do the monitoring of microplastics, and it's a massive problem because it's also to do with intake of water going through industrial processes, so both offshore in energy areas but also onshore, because there they have a lot of desalination plants, so the water is coming in and they're having to deal with all of these microplastics on the filters, and then the energy consumption goes up, so it compounds a lot of different environmental problems that are in like an environmental management system for, say, that desal plant, but also for the government to start monitoring. And they don't have, I don't know in the UK actually about this, but out there they don't have a standard monitoring approach. Right now I'm working on a project for one of the Arabian Gulf countries to set up a microplastics pollution monitoring across their whole coastline. Jordan has just done one and has looked at where most of the microplastics are coming from, and they see that it's from a lot of port areas and coastal areas. So they've gone from the Gulf of Aqaba and they've gone out and they had a look at where the main areas are. So the sources are still coming from coastal areas, which is understandable, obviously, because that's where a lot of it happens. And it's not just shipping accidents, say like when nurdles can go off like a ship and they have a shipping accident. So a lot of it is obviously coming from the coast, just like we understand, and we see the bottles going down estuaries and places in the Far East or in maybe Central America and places like that, which is where a lot of the plastics, the sources are coming from. So at the moment I'm going to be researching into microplastic pollution and setting up a monitoring program for this for this country, and trying to understand what are the best methods to do that and how to tackle it as well, because that's ultimately what they want to do, is to tackle where the sources are coming from their areas, and their waste and their discharges that are coming in. And there, a lot of the time, it's not a regular, like an estuary, it's flash flooding during a big rainfall event. And so, of course, you have all that litter that's sitting on a dry riverbed, and then they have a big thing and everything just gets shot out really, really quickly. So it's about how to clear up those riverbeds and address those sources of microplastics, but also the bigger plastics that are going to shatter as well.
So I wasn't wrong. It's a huge issue. Having talked about monitoring and data collection, it's one thing tracking a blue whale across the ocean because it's massive, right? Microplastics aren't massive, and obviously we're not tracking individual bits of microplastics, but they're everywhere, aren't they? And then I guess there's two main things: stopping them going in the sea for a start, and then how do we then what's already in the sea? How do you get it out? I say sea, marine environment. You know what I mean? Are there solutions? Are there positive solutions out there? Tanya's nodding. Go on.
Yeah. So, Katie, I've done quite a lot on microplastics and litter and pathways and things, particularly in the estuaries. And I was lucky enough in 2017 to sail around Britain monitoring microplastics and larger plastics. So, yes. Microplastics, a lot of people do a little jar from the side of the river or the coastal. The problem with that is often you get the wash, and so you're getting a very mixed sample. As Katie said, they float on the surface, so you can use basically a plankton net that floats on the surface called a mandatrawl. The Fives Jars project started this on the coast and the open ocean. I've used a small one in the Thames and Medway estuaries to do exactly that, and collect fibres in places where the sewage discharges, where wet white mountains appear, those sorts of places. So that you can put barriers in place to collect litter, booms to collect them on the windward side of a marina, something like that. And I think in a nutshell, those waddies you mentioned, Katie, would be clear when they're dry. It's much easier to clear them before they get wet, because once it's in the marine environment, or even in the freshwater environment, it's really difficult to get out. So yeah, there are, and the UK is one of the biggest countries for litter picking. I think we're at least in the top 2 or 3 in terms of the amount of litter picking we do. Yeah, and we have tons of plastics. So I've done a couple of litter picks on the Medway recently. We collected in a good couple of hours over a month litter that was mixed, big polystyrene lumps and all sorts of other things, which is also quite dangerous for marine life. Half of it couldn't be recycled because it was degraded in the environment and the marine environment, broken up as you mentioned, or just degraded in the UV. And that went, luckily, as we were a partner, to the London Marathon, to one of their mile markers, because it can be made into something else, but it can't be recycled into our types of products. But the best way to eliminate plastic pollution is to eliminate plastic items as much as we can. But again, from the UK perspective, the biggest challenge we have is our washing and the fibres and things that we flush down toilets that we shouldn't flush down toilets. Those are the biggest, more challenging pieces of plastic that we're going to have to live a long legacy in. But they found it in our blood now, so it's here to stay, I'm afraid.
It's staying for a while.
Mm.
Well, what a positive that is. So, I guess part of that, obviously, flushing things down the toilets, that kind of thing, that's an education thing. In terms of the clothes that we wear, obviously there's different types of clothes you wear. Again, I suppose that is partly an education thing, isn't it, for knowing what you're buying.
But there's also so the Marine Conservation Society, I know that there are filters that they can put into everybody's washing machine, and that hasn't been mandated yet, and that's something that could be, and it's not a hard thing to do either. It's just changing. It's just changing how those things are manufactured, and it's going back to redesign of items and to try and stop that loss of those plastics into the marine environment. There's alternatives that everybody can do. You can take your different cups. We've banned plastic straws. They're not on beaches now from the Marine Conservation Society. But this is something that is quite easy, that all of the manufacturers can do and put this filter in, apparently. And it's just changing them to do that and then mandating it. But you can also buy from the Marine Conservation Society and other places like a ball that attracts the microfibers to it. So there are things that you can do yourself. It's difficult to get everybody to do that, but that is something you can do as well. And there's obviously the stalling of the Global Plastics Treaty, which is really disappointing. And it was to limit virgin plastic production, because we do have a lot of plastics already, and it's working on reusing those plastics even as they degrade each time you reuse them. But we've got almost a closed loop on clear plastic bottles being used a lot. So there are things that lots of different people in manufacturing and chemical engineering are looking at to try and reuse plastics, use different alternative materials. There are hundreds of different types that you can go to. There's a global design conference every year down in London about it's called the Blue. Now I'm going to be tested again. My brain fog is not very good today. Anyway, there's a brilliant design conference about alternatives for plastics that are also in modern methods of manufacturing. So the different ways that they use the plastics and can extrude them, and there are alternatives that can be used now. And you can also use, so I've also got a startup where I'm trying to remanufacture something from 100% recycled plastics. And I kept getting told, no, you can't, you still have to use virgin. And so it's quite interesting that when, and I'm sometimes a bit stubborn when people say you can't do something, I quite think that that's not the case. As humans, we tend to say that when something's too difficult, or because the status quo is carried on for so long that they always use like 5% virgin plastics when you've got a 100% recycled bottle of something. And so I've been looking into that a lot, and different alternative materials and the circular economy. And it's something that just needs to be tackled and have more research and money going into that as well in the UK.
The other part is, of course, marine environment and marine industry needs use of plastics. So we use plastic ropes instead of hemp. So they break, they wear, they tear, and we have a legacy in both offshore wind and in vessels of GRP, which are sitting in in estuaries and coasts being potentially broken down. So the blades of some of the early offshore wind turbines, and the recycling. I'm not that they're not dumping that. I'm definitely not saying that. But when we design things, we don't think about that. What we do after with it. How do we get rid of that? What happens to it? There are people looking at that. There's a company that recycles GRP hulls and can make products back to the customer who wants the recycling done. So there are companies looking at that innovation like yours, Katie. So there'll be. But it's unfortunately not at the industry doesn't seem to be tackling it. It seems to be those innovators at the grassroots level again. Ironically,
I
More
think they
innovation required.
Yeah, I think for now they have to look at the blades now
they
and
do.
the design.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of offshore wind farms that are coming up to decommissioning or
Yes.
or re-energizing because they're 25 years old. The one just off Hartlepool, that's 25 years old. They're going to need to look at the blades. I know they have done one, and it's gone into near to where Tanya lives actually, and they did cut up, and it's fiberglass panels, but it's trying to chop the size of that that blade into pieces to reuse that in some way. And like Tanya said, 25 years ago, people weren't thinking about what would happen to that blade when it was manufactured, and that creates lots of different little fibers, etc. But now they are trying to think about end of life, either through re-energizing through offshore wind, or coming up with a different alternative to how they manufacture those blades.
I was scrunching my face slightly then because I thought, imagine making something that big. Some of these things are massive, and then not knowing what's going to happen to them at the end of life. Anyway, I always we don't need to comment on that. It just blows my mind.
Yeah.
I've always liked the idea of they talk about covering car parks and solar panels. Wouldn't it be great if they were covered in wind turbine blades that were also covered in solar panels? And anyway, I just thought it'd be very visually appealing. But three other things, and we need to move on. First of all, Sophie, who's running our podcast today, can we do a microplastics podcast and look at 5 things around that? Because we could talk about this for a long time, couldn't we?
Yes, we could.
Another thing is the three of us. How can we try and push through the mandate for washing machines to have those filters? That'd be great. How do we do that? Can we do that? And lastly, and the other thing I was going to mention was in the last podcast we did was about sport, and we talked about the visual cues for sustainability, like green roofs, things like that. And you talked about straws, and then we talked about clothing. And straws you can see. I know you can see clothes, but you can't see that they're plastic. Straws you see, they're obviously plastic. So is that affecting people's thinking around? Because a lot of people know about plastic pollution now, but you just wear clothes, you just wear them. They just, because it's not visually plastic, even though it is plastic. I'm looking at mine, but I think it's cotton. Anyway, but that's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, ironically, a lot of it is made out of that recycled straws that Katie was talking about. So the clothes is then becoming and then washed. So you end up with this, and a lot of the sports teams around, particularly in England, are often made out of EcoNail, which is a remade nylon recycled from nets around the globe that have been retrieved. Katie, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but I think that's the correct. So they're basically they don't, as far as I know, they don't take any supply from the UK, but they take from island communities where the fishermen's or the community is affected by drift netting or ghost netting. And where they've removed them, they then get made into either carpet, eco-nil carpet, or as threads for these types of sports clothing, because that is largely plastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's move on quickly because we this could be our longest podcast ever, but that's fine. We've talked about a lot of interesting stuff. Number 4 of today's protecting the marine environment top 5 is the protection of sites in a changing climate. Because we're not talking about small topics on this podcast, are we? We've talked about climate change now. We've covered waste. We've covered biology. Now we're covering climate change. Tanya, mic's all yours.
Thank you. Well, we've kind of touched on it as we've been talking throughout the podcast, actually. The lines that Katie quite articulately said, we draw a chart. We as humans want to have something on a map or a chart, as we should call them, in the water. But the fish and the birds and the mammals move between those sites around. The water itself is not the same water. And we know that the ocean is getting, or the oceans rather, are getting warmer. And the animals are responding to that. And yet the protections we have are very static. And I think that's something that we need to, as professionals, think about how we recognise that there are certain features for those polygons that we've drawn lines over charts on that may not remain in 10, 20, 35 years. I mean, we're seeing temperatures already in the estuaries right in the heart of them at 24, 25 degrees, right on the edge. It's about 16 in the Thames estuary at the moment, which you'd expect that from May onwards, but it's been that way for quite some time throughout the year. So that changes how the biology of the animals are using that environment. We're seeing much more sea bass, much higher up in our area. It looks like, and there's lots of debate around this, that there might be different spawning periods for those fish because they're using the temperature and they're using different environments to come into the estuaries as a nursery to grow to full size. So and that's going to be true of all sorts of different species. There's a tuna fishery appearing around the coast, even as far up as Katie's area in some cases, and we're seeing things like the octopus versus the crab down in the southwest. So these are not going to be unique, unusual sightings. When I was working in the ports and the Thames, we had belugas, we had all sorts of different mammals swimming into the estuary because they got lost for different reasons, but their migratory routes are shifting. They're finding themselves in different environments and then interacting with humans and perhaps coming off course, but they're being found in different places. So I think it is something that I don't hear a lot of it in a professional environment. We're very much around that static list of features for that static list of polygons or transects. And I think we need to recognise that we cannot keep the standard approach. I get asked a lot, what are we expecting to find in this salt marsh? And often I have to say, well, I would have expected to see X, Y, and Z, but because of the changing temperature or the changing seasons, I wouldn't be surprised if we might see some more southern species. We're starting to see things like mullet coming up the coast, and I'm sure the sea bass will follow the tuna. So we are going to see different species. We wouldn't see sea bass or mullet in teas, but we could do in a couple of years' time. So actually, in reality, that what we would expect to see isn't the science that we have been taught as students, the static list of geographical boundaries. It's changing all the time. So as professional, it's quite difficult to become the expert on those things because, of course, that's moving constantly. But also that protection needs to be future-proof in the very changing environment.
So we've got the marine environment that's adapting to climate change. It sounds like the professionals working in the environmental protection world also need to start adapting or move along to stay relevant, I suppose, and to do their jobs in a useful manner, depending on where they are in the world working on that. That's going to be an interesting challenge. I think we're going to be talking about skills. We've already talked about skills a bit, but it's a changing landscape, isn't it?
And difficult one to teach, and it's not something you could.
Yeah.
How do you tell someone that a sea bass is going to be in teas in 10 years' time? That's a whole predictive. How quickly do they move? The fact that there's this current thinking that there's spawning areas, as sea bass is a good example, moving around from the channel around the coast to somewhere further north in the North Sea. That current thinking is growing a lot of debate because no one can quite prove it. There's a potential for another population. I heard the other day, having discussed this with an expert 30 years my senior on this topic, and he said, well, actually, we're starting to see populations pop up in juvenile salt marsh surveys in Denmark. So, but they aren't coming from here. So where the sea bass ecology is changing as to what we would expect it to be and what I would have been taught, he was taught, and he's learning. So how do I teach that to my interns and to future individuals? Essentially, we're having to teach them that it always changes. This is the principles, and we need to work out what those principles are that we're going to teach these people to continue to make that relevant conservation and protection in the future.
With all the modelling and mapping that's going on, with the changes that are happening because of climate change, can you predict where future highly protected areas should be?
In New Zealand, they just drew lines on any map and they just decided to protect. He said, just do it. You don't have to have the scientific backing. He was very much of the just get it done. So yes, sometimes we can worry about the lines on the map. Like Tanya said, we can do it. And yes, we do need to migrate the boundaries of marine protected areas. And obviously you need those agreements with fishery agreements, whether you can or can't, and you're managing different activities. But at the same time, if it's a highly protected marine reserve and you've got, say, something that's a bit more static, like a sea fan or something, that highly protected zone, you can put that on the map. It might change with obviously that, and that's where it comes back again round to monitoring. But he always said, instead of using the prediction and everything, he said just go for it. Yeah. In New Zealand, they had a very small. They started off with a very small shoreline area just down up from Auckland, and that is what they had, a highly protected zone. They stopped any kind of recreational fishing. They stopped any damaging activities, and that's when a lot of the science from highly protected reserves came from. So so that a lot of it came through New Zealand. That they were the kind of pioneers in completely shutting off areas. So a lot of it came from New Zealand and their examples. But he always said, just get on with it. Just do a certain area, because you will be surprised by what comes back. And I know that science is changing, but as like the Sussex area, the kelp beds that they've got, they protect their own kelp, and that's amazing. Yep. The difference, like the structures coming back in the kelp, they have more, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they've got more lobsters coming in. There's a lot more juvenile fish coming in.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think if you sometimes we worry so much as humans about that science, and I get it, because then you have to prove it. But he was very much like, just get on with it, and just protect a certain area that might not have. And so we do tend to get caught up with kelp, or like the tropical rainforest, or a certain nice oak. I'm talking land and sea. But he was like, well, just protect something and see what nature brings back. And so I think that's happening both on land and at sea. There's the rewilding on land, but it's the same. You can choose a really dodgy bit of ground on land. You could do the same at sea and see what comes back. So I think we do get het up sometimes about that. So that's my answer to your question in it. And that came from that highly protected marine reserve course that I went on years ago. So
I think it's a really good point, because we protect for a feature normally, that in the UK that we tend to focus on something we need to protect, whereas what you're describing, Katie, is very much just put something aside and see what happens with no expectations, and that then becomes climate ready, right? Because we're not saying it has to be salt marsh, it has to be X, it has to be Y, and the monitoring is just to find out. It's not to improve or disprove, it's just to find out. And I think that, yes, Phil, I think to answer your question, yes, we could, but I think in the UK culturally we don't like that approach particularly. No. The rewilding has taken a while to come through as a good example. We like, government authorities generally, and we have a great coastal mileage, but we've also keep it very busy. So there's competing desires for it. So when we say we're going to protect something, the question next is why you have to justify that, and we wrap ourselves up in knots. If we can be as free as the example Katie's given, I think we can do some of this much more effectively.
Well, the objective then was it is not about the science and the feature. It was a protected area for humans to go and enjoy and say, well, actually, I'm in this. So it had different objectives, but I agree, Tanya, culturally we're just not there with it, because we're so focused on these conservation features rather than actually we'll have a protected area for humans because we want one, rather than something else. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's not good to designating in a place not based on science as a protected area. It's not going to have a bad effect on it, is it? You wouldn't have thought. Topic number 5 is our final topic and the biggest takeaway for listeners to consider. It's interesting, I mean, what's going to be bigger than what we've talked about already, but I think we're going to talk about skills. Tanya, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think we've covered it throughout. Again, it's come up a couple of times in what how we're protecting the environment. In my field, fisheries and estuarine fisheries in particular, there are not many people around. I'm I'm essentially the apprentice to someone who's 30 years my senior, and there's not many other people that do some of that work. And it is. It's challenging because that data collection is not there a lot. So the opportunity to train people is limited as well. But what we are seeing is that things like identification of species isn't taught in university anymore. The field skills. I as a student did a lot of field work. I won't tell you how long ago, but not that long ago, and it seems to have all disappeared apart from one trip maybe, and a couple of universities like Swansea, Hull, and some in Scotland as well, looking at different environments, and of course Plymouth and Southampton, who actually have boats, which is another another how else do you get that experience? So I think that skills to go out and do that practical work, but also identify what you're catching, or know what features you're looking for when you're physically catching something or observing something, is limited. In the marine mammal world, people tend to go to NGOs like Marine Life and Orca to get their ID training, and then they move on to an MMO or pass training, but to do that next step up, that upskill, if they're from the UK. So I think it is something that we need to see more of, whether that's within the chartered institutes or in the universities themselves, upskilling and maintaining a natural history approach with the identification is going to be really important to move the next generation into these fields for biology in particular.
Yeah, totally. It's not. I don't just think it's a problem in the UK either. I think it's a global problem. I think people are not just as engaged in their nature and where they are and what they're seeing. I made sure that my kids snorkeled from a very young age, but I don't think they know crab, octopus, turtle, less in the UK, but they understand what different things are, but I don't think they'd be able to understand things, and they're not going into nature conservation or science at all themselves, either of them. My nephew is, but more as a terrestrial, and he's very unique in going to something in Spurn Head called MIGFest, where they do migratory birds, and they do have kids, and they have a junior program where there's people that identify the different waders and wildfowl that come on, and it's a fab festival. Yeah, it's a brilliant festival, and so he goes every year to that because he's only 13, so he's one of the future bird watchers. And like you mentioned, web data and BTO. I mean, I was shocking at birds. I'm absolutely shocking. And one of my first one of my first jobs was to look at the BTO and the Webb's data on the Humber estuary, and to sit out in those, for hours at a time alongside people trying to recognise. And I still am rubbish. I'm still not very good at it. I'm very, very good at underwater benthic habitats. That's where I've done lots of sea search surveys. So that's where a certain area is, and I don't see as many people coming through like diving, scuba diving, doing those surveys, doing sea search. So yeah, I totally agree with what Tanya said, and they just don't seem to be looking at those, like the smaller creatures. But you go down to the seashore and people still do like to rock pool, and you do see families doing it, and the Wildlife Trust do the shore search. And there's lots of different citizen science programs that people can get involved with, and not just from the litter picking, but also from source search or shore source. It's a tongue tangle, that one. But also there's the great egg case hunt, where you can look for egg cases as part of the Shark Trust. That's an awesome one that you just go along the. You can look for them in areas that are near shore if you're snorkeling, but also you look along the strand line for egg cases. So there's lots of different citizen science programs that people can do as well. But I totally agree with Tanya. It's trying to get people excited. I volunteer and just go to I've got 2 high schools nearby, and I volunteer and try and get people into marine sciences. And I live further inland in Yorkshire, and just say, it is an option, or to go into Leeds and areas. I think Sea Changers do it, don't they, Tanya?
I think they've probably funded something, definitely in the region, I mean, Sea Changers, ironically, as a trust, they're based in Leicester, so
well, I can go and join them. Excellent. Just down the road. Oh, I didn't know that.
But they're all about getting people involved. So it's all third-party organisations. So there's probably projects in Leeds. There is a huge list of projects. So apologies, I won't remember all of them. But yeah, they're all across the globe. And Sea Search is one of those. The MCS project, Sea Search, and is something that they've also funded because it's grassroots, it's getting people out there and getting that experience. And they do a lot of education stuff as well. But it needs that teacher to say, I want to do this project, and people like you, Katie, going in to talk to them, because otherwise how do they get interaction? A lot of schools are starting to do rivers in primary, and now we have the natural history GCSE. So I would hope that is where we start, getting some marine interest in those curriculums, but immediately I'm going, well, that's muddy. It's not turtle counting. It's not necessarily as appealing. In some areas, that's going to be quite challenging to get people wanting to do it and enjoying it. But because there's already that expectation barrier of accessing estuaries because they're dirty, because they're brown, in some cases, just not accessible full stop safely. So yeah, there is always going to be that access issue, but if we can bring it to schools rather than bring them to our environment immediately, then that's got to be a good thing.
Quite right. And I guess there's a fair amount of diversity in terms of the types of roles you can have in this. So we talked about data. I guess AI would come into that. So data analytics, that kind of thing. Don't necessarily need to be a marine biologist to do that kind of thing. But if we have experts in those different areas to pull data together globally, whatever, or locally, whatever that might look like, that's going to be making a difference. Because of time, just one last thing. In terms of shark egg cases, in good news, my daughter, who's 5, has been reading up on that and trying to identify which ones are which. So hopefully that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
She's very keen. She's had a What You Should Know About Sharks book for the last few weeks, and she's very excited about it. So
great stuff.
But there's a lot of work to do in terms of skills.
Yeah, and there's awesome opportunities for younger people in the Celtic Sea. There's a program that I know that people are doing blue shark tagging, and they can go and apply to that program. It's every single year. They're trying to find permanent funding now for it, but there's so many opportunities like that in the UK. You don't have to go to I know I have, and I've had some good times, but some of my best times have been in the UK, and some of my favourite wildlife interactions have been in the UK, either diving here, and my most favourite dive was up in Scotland. Absolutely incredible, with loads of dual anemones on our shore. So we have the most incredible underwater wildlife as well here.
And my favourite place I've ever surfed was in Rhossili Bay in Wales. So that's a shout out to the UK. There's obviously plenty of things to do around the world as well. Now, I'm going to have to cut this webinar, this podcast at this point, because we're going, well, I can guarantee this. I think this is our longest podcast we've recorded. So that's that's fine. We've talked about a lot of things, but thank you very much to our guests today. We have covered a lot. If you, the listener, have ideas of what we could have talked about in the marine environment top 5, then let us know in the comments. Always keen to keep that conversation going. And finally, please check out any links and resources in the podcast description to keep on learning. Thank you very much again, and we'll see you in the next episode next month. If you've made it this far, please remember to subscribe wherever you're listening to this episode so you don't miss the next one. Also, rate our podcast and leave a comment to help us reach more people. Thank you very much for listening or watching on YouTube. We look forward to the next episode next month. See you then.